Hello again, YouTube. You know you missed us. We're back. Kyle and Steve, as always. David, once again, is producing. And our very special guest. Let's make sure that he is perfectly framed. He's just as handsome as ever. Ozzy is with us. Thank you for joining us, Ozzy. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me on.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Real quick, guys, I'm just going to run through what we've got coming up again one more time. Then I'm going to vote to Steve, who's going to introduce the topic. Tomorrow, we've got the discussion with the Jehovah's Witnesses and Telltale Atheist and Lloyd Evans. See that sexy nun knocking at your door? After that, on Wednesday, Thursday, yeah, that's right. Secrets of the Pharaohs with Dr. Maggie Bryson. She will be back with us. I will not ask her about the Sphinx, I promise. And then on Friday, the controversial question, should we spank our children? I know that says Thursday. That is an error that I made, but that is going to be Friday at 8 o'clock. And then this weekend is flat out effed up weekend. Saturday at 8, we'll be joined by the most requested guest that we've ever been asked to bring on. I mean, just people coming to Steve, to me. He's been everywhere. And finally, we've got him on Greater Sapien. I'm very excited that he will be joining us. We're going to have a special guest with him. Also, kind of be on the lookout Saturday. Steve, have you gotten anywhere on Russell?
Yeah, I'll message him. I mean, it should be on the second. We're just going to figure out the time because we have Greater Sapien. Okay. So I'll work it out with Russell Glasser on what time he's available.
Yeah, he's from the Atheist Experience. We may have something with him prior to that. And then on Sunday, Beyond the Curve. These guys went through our David Murphy, allegedly Dave, proponent of urine therapy, sovereign citizen, and flat earther. They broke it down. We're going to break it down again, I think, on Sunday. That's going to be at 4 p.m. Eastern. Okay. It's like a marathon. Ready, baby.
This looks like more like a dating thing or something like that. I just kind of
really
creeping me out a little bit. Circles.
I was just thinking about that. We need somebody behind the curtain.
So, I mean, I'm at a disadvantage to begin with here. Whatever. Both the ladies and the men like you guys. So whatever. So we just jump into this. I mean, just jump into the topic and kind of introduce our guest, Ozy Ramses II. People might know him from YouTube. He has a YouTube channel. He deals a lot with philosophy and other kinds of talks relating to, I don't know, great debate kind of topics and atheism and theism and all this other stuff. So what we'll do is basically, the question comes up often is doubt of virtue. And there's been kind of a lot of questions what people mean by his doubt of virtue, what we mean by his doubt of virtue. And so I thought the three of us can kind of get together and maybe discuss from our perspectives why we think doubt is it or is not a virtue. Do you want to like your kind of what you think why doubt is a virtue or why you don't think doubt is a virtue? And then maybe I give my reasoning and then Ozzy can give his or.
Yeah, but first let's let Ozzy introduce himself and tell us a little bit about him for people who may not.
We don't care about Ozzy. I'm just kidding. Ozzy, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please tell us about yourself. People that don't know who you are, where they've been, I don't know, but it seems like everybody knows who you are now. But introduce yourself, talk about your channel a little bit and your background.
All right. Well, there's not a great deal to say. My name is Ozymandias Ramses II. I'm a YouTuber. I live in Ontario, Canada. My background is in contemporary analytic philosophy. I was an aspiring philosopher at one point, although I didn't work as a professional academic, nor did I even complete my PhD. I did do graduate studies, and I had the pleasure of teaching undergraduates while I was pursuing my graduate studies. And some years ago, I got involved in the Great Debate, especially around the time when presuppositionalism was kind of a big thing, and a lot of atheists, including some very prominent atheists in the Great Debate community online and on YouTube, seem to be stumbling over how to contend with presuppositionalism because it wasn't an evidentialist apologetic. It was a purely philosophical apologetic of a sort that they were unfamiliar with, and it was one that I was familiar with, and I thought could actually fairly easily be debunked. So I joined the Great Debate in that context around the time when presuppositionalism was sort of having a heyday. I'm happy that it has receded somewhat in popularity, although I have to say rather selfishly, I rather liked it when it was popular because it was such an obnoxious form of apologetic. And so contrary to the goals of evangelical persuasion, that I was happy. I would have been happy if that was the only form of apologetic. That would have been the undoing of Christianity in my books. So I made a lot of content in connection with that. I've also made a bit of content in connection with moral philosophy, and just everything having to do with the Great Debate generally. And I guess that's about all there is to say about it.
And I remember those times during the presuppositional type things where it was a big thing, and it hasn't just receded; it's pretty much diminished to the point of non-existence. And I think a lot of the people involved in the Great Debate and involved in the discussions had a lot to do with that. I know you had a huge amount of impact on presuppositional argumentation, especially not the Psi 10 clone type version, I should specify. But I miss those conversations too.
I was going to ask about
kind of honing your skills.
Your thoughts about Psi 10.
And well, I don't really know the man. He lives in Ontario as well, actually. I live in Northern Ontario. He lives in Southwestern Ontario, to my understanding. We've never crossed paths. I kept expecting sooner or later we're going to bump into each other. It's never happened. But I haven't exactly sought it out either. So, but I mean, I think he's a sincere Calvinist. And I think he genuinely thinks that he's hit upon a very good apologetic. But in fact, what I think has happened is he has taken a fairly respectable, but I think ultimately incorrect apologetic, and he has kind of dumbed it down. He's produced a very lunk-headed formula that is easily exported and easily imparted to would-be apologists. And it just is really a form of stumping people with a tough philosophical problem, with the promise that their theology can answer the hard epistemological questions that it poses, but without ever actually delivering the goods on their end. So I've never met the man, but I mean, nor am I particularly interested in meeting him.
Yeah,
but are you using your logic and reasoning to determine that, Ozzy?
Yeah, and a good deal of gut feeling.
I think Psi 10 does actually buy into his narrative. Don't get me wrong. I think he is a devout Calvinist. I think that his approach to presuppositional argumentation is the most dishonest that I've ever seen. As you said, it doesn't deliver anything. And once you do get to kind of break it down and see what of his argumentation are, it just falls apart like paper, I think. But it's tough. It's a tough stuff. I mean, when presuppositional argumentation got on the scene, a lot of people didn't know what to do with it. It seemed like a very good argument, and they had a tough time trying to explain, okay, well, how do I have a defense against this? I know we're off topic, but it's fascinating to me.
Well, it's not entirely off topic, because we're going to be talking about the doubt and the role of doubt with respect to skepticism. And I think actually an equivocation that happens between doubt and skepticism, or the having of doubts and the being a skeptic, that there's a kind of confusion that goes on there, actually played into people's vulnerability when they confronted presuppositionalism, because presuppositionalism of the Psi 10 Rugenkate variety, that was cyclone variety, preys upon the idea that you only know something if you can be certain about it, if it's impossible for you to be mistaken. That is, if you have no doubts. And so the idea is if you can doubt something, right, then that means it's dubious. And if it's dubious, then it means there's no good reason to believe it. There's good reason to think that it's wrong. So I think that a lot of people in the atheist/skeptical community fell prey to a trap there that was laid out, in part because they equivocated, or they conflated the having of doubts with skepticism. And I don't think that the two are the same. I think that skepticism doesn't require doubt. The way I would put it is that doubt is neither necessary nor sufficient for skepticism. You can have skepticism without any doubt. Doubts are going to arise, obviously, but I don't think that doubt is a necessary or even a sufficient ingredient in skepticism. And I think there's an important analytical distinction to be made here. And if you don't make that, you can sort of run afoul of certain problems.
I'm interested in that difference. Maybe you could expound upon that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, to my mind, okay, well, let's think about certainty for a minute. Okay, just sort of think of doubt and certainty as sort of being on opposite spectrums, right? You can be highly doubtful of something, and you can be highly certain of something. You know, certainty and doubt are things that admit of degrees. You can say, hell, you know, you have strong doubts about that, you have weak doubts about that, you know, how doubtful is it in your mind, right? You can ask the same thing, how certain are you of that? Are you completely certain, or, you know? So when we speak of doubt and certainty, I think we're speaking of an attitude. That is, we're speaking about our attitude of confidence with respect to the veracity or falsity of a proposition. So, for instance, you know, I've got a cup here in front of me, and you know, how confident are you that this is a cup? Well, you know, seeing as I'm holding it and you can only see it on the screen, or if you're listening to this and you can't see it, you just have to take my word for it. But I'm in a different epistemological position with respect to this cup. I'm in a better evidentiary position with this cup. I can feel it in my hand. I can tap it and hear it and feel it under my touch. Okay, so I'm extremely confident. I'm almost maximally confident that I'm holding a cup here. So with respect to the proposition, am I holding a cup right now? I would say yes, that proposition is true, and I'm extremely confident about it. In fact, I would go so far as to say I don't doubt it. I have no doubts about it. That's not to say that I think it's an inerrant proposition. It's not that it's impossible for me to be mistaken, but I don't actually have any feeling of doubt, right? And if anything, I have a feeling of certainty. I'm maximally confident. So I think one way to, probably the most accurately descriptive way of speaking about doubt is that it's an attitude, a degree. It describes your confidence relative to a proposition, just the way certainty does. So you can feel certain about a proposition. You can be doubtful about a proposition. So as I see it, doubt is a feeling. It's a kind of attitude. It's a feeling that bubbles up inside you. And just as I don't believe that I decide my beliefs, I don't choose my beliefs, I just have my beliefs. My beliefs are the product of neural processes, right? Like if, for instance, I hold up my hand in front of me and you ask me, Ozzy, is that a human hand in front of you? And I look at it and I go, yeah. I have this non-inferential belief. I didn't have to go through a process of reasoning. I just directly perceive this hand. And given the rest of my background beliefs and assumptions, I take it that, yep, this is a human hand. I have no doubts about it. Okay. This is a non-inferential procedure here. So I forgot where I was going with this, but with respect to doubt, I have a feeling of certainty. I don't have a feeling of doubt whatsoever about whether this is a human hand or whether I'm holding a cup in my hand. When a person has doubts, though, those arise in you just as helplessly as the belief that, this is where I was going originally, the belief that this is a human hand arises in me helplessly. So I hold up my hand. I helplessly believe that I'm holding up my hand. I can see it. I can feel it. I can snap my fingers and hear it. Okay. I am not inferring or coming to some tentative or provisional conclusion. I absolutely believe that this is a human hand that I'm holding up here. It's not that I couldn't be mistaken. I could be dreaming about it. Okay. But nevertheless, I don't think that I'm dreaming. I don't think that's a live possibility. And so I don't have any doubts. I can't even muster a doubt, but I can muster the question, right? I can still be skeptical about the question, right? So in my view, doubts are not something that you do. Doubts are things that you have, just like beliefs. Beliefs happen to you. I happen upon my beliefs. They happen to me. In the face of good evidence, hopefully, if I'm a rational being, my beliefs will change. And similarly, my degree of confidence will go up and down in the face of evidence, either for a belief that I have or against a belief that I have. And so my doubt or confidence or certainty will go up and down. All right. Now, this is not something that I decide. This is something that happens quite beyond my control. It's almost like perception. You know, when I look at a human hand, I just perceive the hand. I don't decide to see a human hand. I just see a human hand quite helplessly. And similarly, when I see my human hand here in front of me helplessly, I also am filled with the feeling of absolute confidence that I'm looking at my human hand here. Okay? I didn't decide that. It's out of my control. So doubt isn't something that I do. Doubt is something that I just feel. It accompanies my belief. In fact, it is simply a way of describing the degree to which I think a claim is dubious or not. In this case, I don't think it's dubious at all. But if you confront me with a proposition like people didn't actually land on the moon, that it was all a hoax, that it was all filmed in a lab and stuff like that on a sound stage or something like that, immediately I am filled with doubts. Everything that you tell me about this from there on is going to be filled with doubts. Now, why is that? Well, simply because it conflicts with what I already believe. And that's just part of the nature of doubt. As soon as you believe one thing and someone comes along and gives you a piece of evidence that conflicts with what you believe, the first thing that happens is you doubt the evidence. It just happens quite naturally, right? Now, you don't have to abide by that. You can inquire into the matter and overcome that doubt. But the doubt arises naturally, just bubbles up, right? So doubting isn't something that you have to practice or cultivate. Everybody just doubts anything that strikes them as false. Right? As soon as you hear or encounter anything that conflicts with what you already take to be the case, you regard it as dubious. That's just sort of a natural way to be. There's nothing wrong with that either. That's just the way our minds work. And I submit it's actually the way our minds should work. Similarly, if someone tells me something that is consistent with everything else that I believe, I am going to lend credence to it. I'm going to lend it my at least provisional credulity, quite helplessly. I don't decide to do that. It will happen. I will feel very confident that what you're saying is true, simply because it meshes so perfectly with everything else I already take to be true. So feelings of confidence or lack of confidence bubble up as feelings that accompany beliefs, and how they bubble up depends largely on whether or not what we're hearing or seeing or encountering or discussing conforms to what we believe or doesn't conform to what we believe. And so it doesn't. This is why I don't think it's an epistemological virtue to doubt, because I think we don't decide it anyway. It's not like I can't exercise doubt. It just happens to me. I can feign a doubt. I can say, while holding up a human hand in front of me here, I wonder if this is a human hand. I can wonder about that. I can question that belief. But I don't actually doubt it. I'm feigning doubt when I do that, right? I can pinch myself until it hurts, and I can ask myself, am I really feeling pain, or but nevertheless, I will be feeling the pain, and I will be feigning that I don't feel the pain when I ask the question. So doubt can be sincere or it can be insincere, but strictly speaking, a feigned doubt isn't doubting at all. It's actually doing something else. It's actually acting as if you doubt something when you in fact don't doubt something. And that, I think, actually can be a virtue. In fact, the difference between doubt and skepticism, as I see it, is that skepticism isn't about doubting. It's like a lot of people think that because they have doubts that they're a good skeptic, right? But I mean, the proof that that's not the case is I mean, look at any conspiracy theorist, right? Or someone who is, part of the New Age movement and believes in, naturopathy and homeopathy and, homeopathic remedies and all kinds of alternative medicines that are not evidence-based and stuff like that, and who are highly mistrustful of so-called Western biomedicine, for instance, right? They are filled with doubts, and they think of themselves as skeptics, right? Why? Because they're filled with doubts, right? But I don't think merely doubting something, regarding something as dubious, constitutes skepticism. In fact, in my view, a lot of people who are in the New Age movement are among the most credulous, gullible people I've ever met. The same can be said of a lot of conspiracy theorists. They're incredibly gullible and credulous, and yet they think of themselves as skeptics. But they think of themselves as skeptics because in their minds, skepticism is constituted of having doubts, right? If you have doubts, that qualifies you as being a skeptic. And in my view, that's not what skepticism is. I think skepticism is better understood not as the having of doubts or trying to doubt or feigning doubt, but rather interrogation. Skepticism, as I understand it, is about inquiry. It's about interrogation. It's about examination. It's about looking for evidence, evaluating arguments and reasons. That is what skepticism should be about. And if you think about the whole toolkit that's involved in critical thinking, for instance, the ability to identify fallacies, for instance, the ability to understand the nature of induction and deduction and abduction and things like that. Everything that makes up what we think of as critical thinking. These are all tools that allow us to know when to doubt. When ought we to doubt? And so when you become a skeptic, as you try to study how to become a skeptic by studying critical thinking skills, by studying logic, deductive and inductive and abductive, for instance, what you are studying, what you are learning is when and where you ought to doubt. Because you can doubt in all the wrong places at all the wrong times and for all the wrong reasons. And that doesn't make you a skeptic. That makes you actually a credulous and fairly gullible. It can make you paranoid and cynical. So that's the distinction that I think needs to be made between skepticism and doubt. Yes, skeptics have doubts, but it isn't the having of doubts that makes them skeptics. It's a capacity rather to examine, to inquire, to be critical, and sometimes doubts will bubble up out of that. Sometimes more confidence will bubble up out of that, right? But that is what constitutes skepticism. It's not the having of the doubts. So that's in short. In short, that wasn't short at all. But in full, that is my view.
I'm about to show you short. I'm about to show you short.
Real quick, if I could just add on to that for this, I don't personally take on the skeptic label per se, and let me ask you why, if this makes sense to you. I agree, skepticism is something we all should have, and we all should be skeptical of things in due course. More of a methodological system, though, that we should question things, right? Not and when I hear the term skepticism, to me, for some reason, it just kind of goes to more, the study of or the question of can we even have knowledge, right? So when I hear that term skepticism, skeptic, is it wrong for me just to kind of put it as one thing as somebody who wants to know if we can even have knowledge as opposed to somebody who just wants a methodological approach to how we have knowledge?
Okay, what you're talking about there, what you're describing there is a position within philosophy known as philosophical skepticism. And there are actually different kinds of philosophical skepticism. There's Pyrrhonic skepticism, and there's all kinds of different forms of philosophical skepticism. And they all have to do with whether or not knowledge is even possible, right? Or maybe knowledge is possible, but maybe none of us can have it. Or maybe knowledge is possible, but we can't know that we know. And so forth, right? So there's all kinds of positions with respect to what knowledge is and whether or not we can attain it. And there's a tradition within philosophy called philosophical skepticism that dates all the way back to antiquity, that holds that actually knowledge is blocked to us. We cannot actually know things, and it has nothing to do with certainty. And it's just that we're not even in a position to ever claim anything better than maybe warranted assertability at best, and maybe not even that. That maybe we can't ever even be warranted in our beliefs, because to be warranted in our beliefs, we would have to know certain things, for instance, right? So that's one usage of the word skepticism. That is a traditional usage of the word skepticism within philosophy. But outside of philosophy, in the vernacular, there is another usage of the word skepticism that is, I think, to be associated with the concept of critical thinking. Okay, so if you think of like magazines like Skeptical Inquirer, or the Skeptic Magazine, or something like that. Or if you think of people like James Randi, right? And people in the skeptical movement, like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Carl Sagan, and all of these figures that we've heard of, they are part of a skeptical movement. That is, these are people that are encouraging people to improve their critical thinking skills, or acquire some if they don't have any, or if they're severely lacking in them. And the idea is that critical thinking skills allow us to sift between true beliefs, false beliefs, and just outright bullshit. And it's a way of being less wrong, or at least nudging us in the direction of greater accuracy in our map of reality, right? Our picture of the world. So it's the skepticism that I've been talking about here is not the philosophical school of skepticism, of which there are many. I'm not talking about a school of philosophical skepticism. I'm talking about skepticism as a movement to be identified with the concept of critical thinking, which I think is important. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Fresh, real quick. I'll just bear with you.
Okay, so I think that to my mind, skepticism consists of all of the things that we think of as critical thinking tools. It includes philosophy. It includes a study of logic, both formal and informal, and inductive and abductive. It includes an understanding of the scientific method, especially, and understanding scientific values. That, to my mind, is what is constitutive of skepticism in this context. So I'm not talking about the school of philosophical skepticism that affirms that knowledge is impossible or just not to be had for whatever reason.
Right, Kyle. I just wanted to ask him about that real quick.
Oh, okay. Well, following that, I am taking the question, is doubt a virtue, as simple as possible. Now, following what you said, it's going to be even more simple. But I'm not looking at it from a philosophical standpoint, or going deep into it like that. I'm just merely looking at it from if we pull up right now what the definition of a virtue is, there are 4 here, and it says a conformity to a standard of right, a particular moral excellence, a beneficial quality or power of a thing, which is where I'm going to take one side. Manly strength or courage, a commendable quality or trait, and a capacity to act. So if I'm asked the question, is doubt a virtue, just going with a beneficial quality or power of a thing, I'm going to have to say yes, because I think in most cases it benefits you to doubt. Now, let's say that you, like you were saying, doubting something that you know to be true. I think that the worst harm that comes from that is that you merely confirm what you were thinking was right in the first place. So outside of the philosophy, because I know that there are, Steve he's tried to explain it to me quite a few times, but there are different arguments that you can make from a philosophical standpoint. But I'm just coming from, is doubt a virtue, with the word virtue as it stands in the dictionary? And so I have to say, yes, doubt is a virtue.
Yeah, well, there are different uses of the word virtue. So one sense is sort of a moral virtue. For instance, courage is a moral virtue. Patience is a moral virtue. Honesty is a moral virtue. Generosity is a moral virtue. Well, we're not talking about moral virtues, presumably. We're talking about epistemological virtues here, right? Now, the definition that you gave there was, could you read it again? It was something about something to do with about a benefit or power, or?
Sure. The definitions are a conformity to the standard of right, a particular moral excellence, a beneficial quality or power of a thing, manly strength or courage, and
beneficial quality.
That was the one. So that was the one that you were talking about, a beneficial power or quality. Yeah. And there, I think what the dictionary there might have in mind is a different usage of the word virtue. For instance, there's a way that we use the word virtue. For instance, if I say, it was by virtue of his good driving that an accident was avoided, right? or it's by virtue of her good looks that she was able to attract that man's attention. Or so when we say by virtue there, what we mean is what we're pointing to is a quality by means of which, that's what we mean by a power. It's because of that they possess, someone possesses or exhibits, or something possesses or exhibits a certain quality that makes it capable of something, that lends it a certain power. Okay, so I think that might be what that particular, because definitions, there's often like definition 1, 2, 3, 4, like definition 3 there, whatever, right? I think is trying to capture that particular usage, that pattern of usage of the word virtue, where we use the word virtue to mean a feature or trait that confers some capacity or power to something. Okay, now we can use that. In this case, we can say it's by virtue of how doubtful he was that he didn't believe that particular belief, or it's by virtue of how doubt-filled so-and-so is that he avoids believing a lot of New Age nonsense or something like that. You could sort of construe it that way, but I don't. Again, for the reasons I gave earlier, I don't think that doubt needs to be, but it definitely even shouldn't be construed as something that you can exercise with your will. I think we doubt things quite helplessly. If I believe something fairly strongly, and you hit me with reasons that erode it, I might not abandon my belief immediately, but over time, there's a good chance that my confidence will be eroded. That is, doubts will creep in. So doubts very often lead to belief revision, right? And I think this is why I think doubt is often valorized within the skeptical movement. A lot of people in the skeptical movement think that doubt is a great thing, because doubt is often it's the having of doubts. It's the having of doubts that often leads us to revise our beliefs and abandon completely misbegotten beliefs that we had. I mean, all of us have sort of believed things that in hindsight, we look upon with embarrassment, right? I mean, I used to be a Jehovah's Witness. So I believed all manner of twaddle. What's that?
You really?
He was a young Christian.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in my teenage years, I grew up in a household that was Jehovah's Witness. Yeah. I mean, I was never baptized myself or anything. I didn't do any door-to-door witnessing, but that was the theology that I grew up with. So, I mean, I have believed all kinds of nonsense. And at one point, I believed in UFOs and Bigfoot and all kinds of twaddle. I had a head full of nonsense.
You've come a long way.
How did you do all of that, though, Ozzy?
Well, that's a long story, but along the way, doubts crept in. Right? But doubts crept in not because I decided to doubt them. I certainly didn't decide to doubt them. In fact, with respect to my religious beliefs, I never would have wanted to doubt them. In fact, I would have considered it a moral failure to doubt them. It would have been considered backsliding. It would have been considered disloyal to my God and Savior to have doubts, to even entertain doubts. Rather, the doubts happened to me. I was sort of interested in the natural world and science, and I was a backyard astronomer. You can't be a teenager who's sort of, wedded to a kind of young earth theology and be interested in backyard astronomy without sort of running headlong into the idea of a very old universe and a very old earth. I was also fascinated by dinosaurs. Again, another scientific fascination that flew in the face of my theology. So in encountering these things, doubts arose, but I never decided to doubt. I wasn't exercising doubt. I couldn't have willed myself to doubt even if I wanted to. I can't will myself to doubt right now that this is a bad tasting scotch. This is a very fine tasting single malt. I couldn't muster a doubt if I tried. But that's not to say that I couldn't have doubts. I just couldn't will them. So doubts, I think, are like beliefs. We don't decide to have them. They happen to us. And I can't will myself to doubt. I can't try to doubt. But that doesn't mean I can't question. And here, I think, is the sort of the important distinction between skepticism and doubting. A good skeptic, a real skeptic, isn't someone who just questions what he or she doubts. Everybody automatically questions what he or she doubts. Anything that strikes you as false strikes you as dubious. And you immediately, effortlessly, you can find fault with the arguments and the evidence. You will question the evidence. You'll question the sources. Immediately your mind will be filled with questions and a disposition to interrogate and criticize the thing that gave rise to your doubts, right? What's really hard is calling into question the things that you don't doubt, the things that you're wedded to. A real skeptic isn't someone who exercises doubt. A real skeptic is someone who actually, despite not having any doubts, despite feeling absolutely confident and certain about something, decides, I'm going to critically examine that which, as far as I can tell by my lights, there's no reason to doubt at all. Right? That, I think, is the mark of a really good skeptic. If you can take the things that strike you as obviously true and try to examine them and formulate arguments against your own position and understand the arguments not just for your position but against your position, and try to see the sense in the arguments against your position, and try to see the sense in the opposing position, not just the objections to your own position, but see the sense in the opposing position, right? So as to perhaps eventually elicit doubts in yourself. That, I think, is a good thing. So in other words, I think skepticism is an epistemological virtue. Interrogation, critical thinking, in other words, is an epistemological virtue. And as a consequence of that, as a byproduct of that, doubts arise. But I think that the doubts are not the virtue. They're the symptom. They're the byproduct of the virtue. But because these two so often go together hand in glove, I think that we often speak of doubt as a virtue. And in fact, we will sometimes hear people say something like this. So here's an argument sort of that militates against my own position a little bit. A person will sometimes say something like, yeah, I doubt that's true. I'm very skeptical of that. And they'll often say that they're skeptical of something without actually giving you any reasons why. They're just expressing doubt. So sometimes the word skepticism is used in place of the word doubt, which I think is another reason why I think these two words often get conflated. People will often say, as a way of merely expressing that something is dubious to them, they will often say, I'm very skeptical of that. In fact, you will hear everybody whoever, no matter how naively credulous they are about something, let's say take some new age belief in crystals or something like that, you'll say, how did you ever get into crystals? They'll say something like, oh, well, I was extremely skeptical, which is to say that they didn't believe it. They had doubts about it. And at some point they started to believe it. But were they skeptical? Did they actually come to believe it in the power of crystal healing and stuff like that on the basis of applied skepticism? No. They're just using the word skepticism as a substitute, as a cognate word for the fact that they had doubts. I had doubts. And so they use the word skepticism. But I think it's a mistake. I think that those of us in the skeptical movement, I consider myself one, we would do well to distinguish between skepticism and doubt and recognize that doubt can be a byproduct or consequence of skepticism. Sometimes the consequence of critical thinking and skepticism is a greater confidence. Most people's confidence in evolutionary theory, for instance, increases when they look into it. Even if they believed it because everyone around them believes it, right? Certainly my confidence that the Earth is flat was extremely high. Oh, is flat. Sorry, that the Earth is a globe was extremely high before I encountered flat earthers in the last year or so. Yeah, that could have got me in trouble.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Give me an example of what you would consider to be one of the chief virtues.
Epistemological virtues?
Well, maybe this is a good time because people are asking here, and I'm not get deep into this stuff. I really don't.
No, hang on, Steve. I really want to address Pal's question, but I'm not sure. Were you asking about moral virtues or epistemological virtues?
I can't answer that because I don't know what
okay. So a moral
that's what I wanted to talk about.
Virtues that have to do with right and wrong.
Right now. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So a moral virtue is a virtue that has to do with right and wrong, right? Good and bad. Okay. An epistemological virtue is a virtue that has to do with the concept of knowledge or true belief. All right. So an epistemological virtue would be a virtue that is a habit of mind, let's say, that conduces or leads to you having true beliefs. So, for instance, the capacity to recognize relevant authorities as opposed to irrelevant authorities, genuine expertise, that I think is an epistemological virtue. If you have the capacity to recognize relevant expertise, okay, then you will, on average, up your game and end up with a truer picture of reality than if you are unable to tell who is a charlatan from who is, in fact, a relevant expert in any given field, whether it's science, whether it's history, whether it's linguistics, whether it's philosophy. It doesn't matter what. I mean, it could be knitting. It doesn't matter what. Okay. Another epistemological virtue, I think, would be open-mindedness. And I think the way to think of open-mindedness is not as a willingness to change your mind, because again, I don't think we will our minds to change. We don't will our beliefs, but rather a capacity to have your beliefs revised and updated on the basis of good reasons and evidence. A person, like you'll just hear people say things like, "Oh, I'm very open-minded. You know, I've changed my mind on this subject 15 times in the last 2 years." That is not an open mind. That is someone who does not know how to sift through evidence and just gets blown around by whatever they hear that in that moment strikes them as provisionally plausible. But that they probably don't have good bullshit detectors and probably don't have good critical thinking skills. So the mere ease with which you change your mind, I don't think is open-mindedness. I don't think that's a virtue. But if your mind has been trained because you have studied critical thinking, you've studied logic, you understand science and so forth, you value reasons and evidence. If you have a mind that has been trained to value reasons and evidence and that responds by changing confidence up and down in response to good reasons and evidence, that I think is an epistemological virtue. That I think is the true sense of open-mindedness. That's the sense in which we want to be open-minded. You don't want to be open-minded in the sense that you change your mind all the time. You want to have your mind change for the right reasons, for good reasons, not any old reasons.
Let me ask you this to that point, because you said that you should strive to change your way of thinking and be open to that. Isn't that something that you're choosing to do though? Like you're actually actively choosing.
I don't choose to change my mind. I don't think I can choose to change my mind. Everything that I believe to be true, I believe to be true. I'm not going to try and I don't try to change my beliefs because I think they're right. If I didn't think they were right, I wouldn't be calling them my beliefs. Everything that I believe to be true is by definition what I think is the case. That's what a belief is. It's what you think is the case. So when I believe something, whether I believe it for good reasons or bad reasons, I think it's true. Okay, that's what it is to have a belief. And so I never set out to change my beliefs. Okay, I do want, though, to have an accurate map of reality. And I do recognize that in the past, I've had false beliefs, which is to say, I believe things thinking they were true, but they turned out to be false. So one of my beliefs is I recognize my own fallibility. I don't want to continue to wallow in error, so I do want to discover my errors, however embarrassing and painful it can be in the moment to discover my own errors. But I can't just decide to change my mind. I can't decide to, I can't will myself to change my mind. And I can't, I mean, even sort of, you hear people say like, I'm very willing to change my mind. You don't need to be willing to change your mind to be open-minded. This, I think, is another misconception that people have, a misconception not about doubt here, but a misconception about the nature of open-mindedness. People think that open-mindedness consists of a willingness to change their mind. And they'll often say, oh, well, so-and-so said, I can never have my mind changed. Well, there's no point in talking to him. That, I think, is a cop-out. People change their minds all the times about things that they think are certain. I changed my mind about my deepest, most fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality, God, morality, all of that changed. In the course of studying philosophy, I changed my position on the mind-body problem. I changed my position on morality. I changed my position on epistemology. I changed my position on aesthetics and axiology. I changed my position on, I mean, over the years, everything. And in every case, I was digging in my heels, trying to not have my mind changed, trying to defend my belief as capably as I knew how, while trying to take on board legitimate objections. And I found that quite helplessly, my mind changed. So I mean, ask yourself, whenever you have changed your mind about something significant, was it always because you decided, or has it never happened to you that you've changed your mind in the very teeth of a desire to continue to believe something that you believe? We've all had the experience, I think, of believing something, being wedded to it, and losing grip. Like, we didn't decide, we didn't let go. It just, our grip failed us. We felt we could no longer believe. Right? We lost our belief helplessly, just as we helplessly acquired our beliefs. And so I think that the way to understand believing things and doubting and certainty and uncertainty and all of these things is as byproduct of what's going on in your brain. And of course, your brain can be better or worse trained with respect to responding to evidence. You can, if you don't know anything about critical thinking, you don't know anything about logic, you don't know anything about philosophy, it's harder to be a critical thinker, and it's harder to be open-minded. That is, it's harder to have your mind change in response, and you're more susceptible to having your mind changed by bogus arguments and bullshit reasons and highly dubious evidence, right? So I think that open-mindedness isn't even a willingness to change your mind. It's a capacity. It's having trained yourself over the years to change your mind in response to good reasons and evidence. It's an ongoing process. Everyone is sort of, somewhere on the scale there. It's kind of like fitness. It admits of degrees. I think there are some areas, for instance, that I think I'm actually very good. I'm very open-minded on some questions. I hold my own beliefs at a certain distance, and I'm capable of being emotionally distant and not so wedded and evaluating the evidence better. There are other arenas of my life where I absolutely suck at it, where I'm quite helpless and I get blown around by my passions all over the place to my own embarrassment and complications in my life at times. So I don't think that open-mindedness is something that you will or decide either. How open-minded you are is, again, something that is more or less out of your control at any given moment. But you can, at any point, decide, I would really like to be more open-minded. That is to say, I would like to have a mind that is capable of revising its beliefs in response to good reasons and good evidence, which means I need to know the difference, which means I need to study critical thinking. Now, you can decide to undertake a project like that, right? But just like you can decide to become fit, you can't decide to suddenly be fit. I cannot, through an act of will, decide to be fit, but I can become fit. I can decide that I want to become fit, but I have to learn. There are things that I have to do, exercises I must perform to eventually become fit. And it's the same thing, I think, with respect to being skeptical and a critical thinker and open-minded. There are things that you can do, things that you can undertake, courses of study that you can undertake. And then you don't have to go to university. You can do all of these things rather informally. And over time, you will just get better at it. I think everyone actually in the course of their lives gets somewhat better at it. Some people get much better, some not. That's all.
I think I know what loosened your religious hold back then that you were talking about when you said it wasn't all at one time. It was the grip that was kind of taken out of your hand. I believe I know what did that, Ozzy. And you conceded before we went on air that doubt, virtuous doubt, is exactly what did it.
Oh, did I? Oh, yeah, did I?
Let me ask you, Ozzy.
I remember that a little. I remember that conversation a little differently. But when we were testing our mics.
But
well,
do you think that's something we do have under control, Ozzy? Do you think that's something we have under control? Like you said, if we want to train our mind to be critical thinkers, that we want to have such virtues that we have open-mindedness, fair-mindedness. I think I agree with you 100%. Those are epistemic virtues. Is that something that we just have to practice at in order to have those type of things? And again, I know a lot of people are asking for some technical stuff. We're not going to get into technicalities here. I'm sorry, but I mean, in a general what it means to be virtuous, because everybody's asking this, and I will tell you, I come from an Aristotelian type point of view. I think virtues are mean vices. That's how I look at it. But for the people that are asking, how do you train your mind to try to obtain these types of virtues, that one things that we do have control over to try to reach, rather than things that we don't have control over? Because I agree, I don't think we have control over doubt any more than we do over belief. I can't believe myself to fly. I can't doubt myself the things I know. But I think both of them, we strive to have beliefs that are true, and we do strive to have doubts. Don't doubt things that are false. Those things I do agree. But that doesn't make belief a virtue, and it doesn't make doubt a virtue. It just makes them things that we can utilize to try to ascertain an accurate map of our reality. And real quickly, doubt to me is basically indecision. When I look at doubt, it's basically a vacillation between two things. And I'm having a belief and I'm in a belief and I'm trying to figure out which one it is. And that can lead to correct beliefs. But doubt itself, to me, is something we go out of our way to strive for. We don't say, let's just doubt everything. No, you can be skeptical of things, but I don't use those terms skeptical and doubt interchangeably, like very specific separate things. Did you kind of address that for the people who are asking on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of points there. Let me touch on one thing you said at the very end. Let me start with the end. You talked about doubt as indecision. I think that when one is indecisive or inconclusive on a question, if one is agnostic with respect to a certain question, you're just undecided, do you want to have pizza tonight, or do you want to go out for Chinese food, right? And you go, I don't know, I can't make up my mind. You decide, right? I mean, that's a kind of indecision, right? But there's no truth of a proposition there, right? But you could ask me another, proposition, like, what kind of beer is in that glass over there that's just been poured? And I can't see the bottle, and I'll say, well, I don't know, right? I'm indecisive. I don't know. I don't know if it's a lager. I don't know if it's, if it's an IPA, or, I have no idea really. So that is obviously if a person were to say that's an IPA or that's a lager or something, I would say, well, I have doubts. I'm completely indecisive. But you don't have to be on the fence kind of indecisive. You don't have to have doubts that always put you on the fence. You can have very minor doubts. You can have niggling doubts. You can think that something is true and be, extremely confident. Nevertheless, you have certain misgivings or things that you think are a little dubious about it. And then there are other things you'll hear about, like someone will say, hey, I went camping last weekend and I heard Bigfoot calling out at night. Right away, my BS detectors go off, and I don't believe a word of it. And if I said something like, oh, well, I doubt that's true, that's another way of me saying, I don't think it's true. My doubts there give rise to my actual unbelief, or rather my unbelief has given rise to a very, very high degree of doubt, would be a more accurate way of saying it. So doubt is something that admits of degrees. You don't have to think of doubt as something that leaves you on the fence in a condition of indecision. You can be decided. You can commit one way or the other, nevertheless have doubts. You can have a lot of doubts or little doubts. With respect to the nature of the virtuous nature of skepticism and critical thinking, I think the way to understand critical thinking and skepticism is it's a virtue in the sense that if you have some proficiency in critical thinking, if you are skeptical in that sense, that is, you have some proficiency in critical thinking skills, then that will conduce to you moving in the direction of true beliefs and losing false beliefs. You will avoid error with greater reliability and land in a more accurate picture of reality on average. Sometimes there'll be a mistake, but on average, it will conduce that way. So the sense in which I think skepticism or critical thinking tools, for instance, or an understanding of logic, for instance, are virtues, is that they are virtues because they conduce to the having of true beliefs, which is something that everybody wants. right? Belief is about truth. Belief is about having an accurate picture of reality. The point of a map is that it actually represents, to some degree, the actual topography, the lay of the land. That's the point of a map. The point of a map is to accurately describe. And that's what a belief is. The set of your beliefs, your belief set, your worldview, is the sum total of everything that you think is the case. You want whatever you think is the case to be right. Right? If you're in the business of having any beliefs at all, you have a concern for the truth. Okay. So what makes critical thinking a virtue is that it conduces to that thing that you value. You value the truth. Everyone values the truth. Right? To take a page out of Sam Harris's book, there's nothing more sacred than the facts. Everyone wants to possess the facts. And if there's a methodology out there, if there are procedures out there that tend to make you less wrong, that tend to help you avoid errors and drive you in the direction of a more accurate map, to update your map so that it gets more and more veridical, more and more true to the land, okay, then that's a virtue. That's what I mean when I say that critical thinking and skepticism are virtues. And as to how you cultivate and acquire this virtue, right, this mental disposition, well, you study some logic. You just go out and, like, look up on Wikipedia or crack an intro textbook, or Introductory Logic for Dummies or something like that, and you learn a little bit about deductive logic. You learn about some basic rules of inference. You learn about induction. You learn about fallacies, formal fallacies and informal fallacies, because learning about fallacies is learning how to spot mistakes in reasoning, right? Studying the scientific method is extremely helpful, because science involves checking with the world. It's not a matter of just sort of sitting in an armchair and speculating and coming up with an internally consistent picture. You have to come up with an internally consistent picture that is also consistent with the available evidence, right? And that available evidence is ever growing and expanding. And it gets harder and harder to come up with a theory that accords with all of the facts and yet is wrong, right? It's actually hard to generate a theory that accords with the facts and is completely wrong. You kind of have to work at that. If you can come up with a theory that accords with all the facts, you're going to be inclined to think that it's very likely true. It's only coming up with a theory that accords with half the facts and is therefore wrong. That's trivial. Anybody can do that. Anyone can generate theories that only accord with a few facts, but not all of the facts. Coming up with a theory that accords with all of the facts, that's very hard. So when you study science, one of the things that happens when you study science is you learn about certain other kinds of values. You learn about the value of the sharing of data, of open inquiry, of making your findings public, of making them open in the sense that they are to be scrutinized and criticized by other people, so that they can be replicated, but also so they can be shot down if there's a mistake in your methodology or in your findings, or if they just can't replicate them for whatever reason. So things like openness and honesty and openness to criticism, for instance. The idea that more minds are better than just your own mind, right? These are actually values. Science is shot through with values. These are good values. These scientific values are actually good values, and they are values. These are things that we've had to learn. There was a time when there was no science in the world, right? When there wasn't this degree of organized, systematized common sense, right? It has taken us millennia as a species and a civilization to figure out that there are practices, social practices, cultural practices, and individual thinking, reasoning practices and procedures that we can follow that conduce to the truth. So when you study science, when you study the history of science, when you study an actual specific science, you learn certain things. You pick up certain values. You come to appreciate things like Occam's razor, the principle of parsimony, right? Of eliminating redundant posits or hypothetical entities that don't actually do any work in your theory, right? The fifth wheels, you learn to get rid of them. You learn to appreciate the value of Occam's razor. You learn to appreciate the principle of falsifiability, right? Of testability. So when you study science, when you study formal logic, when you study informal logic, when you study fallacies, when you immerse yourself in all of the things that we call critical thinking, you become a better skeptic. You become a better bullshit detector, and your brain becomes, over time, better oriented at pointing at things that are more likely to be true than false, and that's what makes them a virtue, and that's how you cultivate that. You just have to study these things. You cannot be a good skeptic simply by doubting everything, right? Or just being cynical, right? There's a difference between cynicism and skepticism, and I think a cynic is someone who just doubts irresponsibly, whose doubts are not warranted. I mean, beliefs need to be warranted, but doubts need to be warranted. You want to doubt things for the right reasons. People who doubt things for the wrong reasons end up being conspiracy theorists, right? They're doubting all the wrong things, and that doesn't help them. That they are crippling their own bullshit detectors. I mean, I hope that answers the question.
Steve, did you want to go?
Defensively, yes.
Were you going to follow up?
Kyle?
Okay. I guess where I'm having the struggle of understanding is what you can choose to do and not to do. So you can't choose to doubt, right? But you can
right. I don't think you can choose to doubt, but you can choose to question. You can question things that you don't even doubt, right? You can ask, consider the question: is there a mind-independent reality? I mean, right now I'm standing here in Ontario, and you are somewhere in the U.S. I believe that you're not a figment of my imagination, and I'm not dreaming right now. I believe that you're a real flesh and blood human, responding to me in real time with only a little bit of lag because of the distances involved. And that there is a laptop in front of me with a camera pointed at me, and that there was a glass of scotch here in my hand. And there's all these things that I think exist outside of my mind, so that if I disappeared, they would all still be there, right? I mean, if someone killed me, or if I winked out of existence, the rest of the world would still be there. I wouldn't know about it, but it would still be there, right? That is a belief that I have. I'm committed to this idea that there exists a mind-independent reality. I think everybody listening actually tacitly believes that, if not explicitly affirms it. Now, I can call it into question, though, right? There's a position called philosophical idealism, for instance, that posits that the world isn't a physical mind-independent reality. And there's a position called solipsism that says, actually, there aren't other minds. There isn't another world out there. All of the world is in my mind. And all of the other minds out there are just figments of my imagination. There's just me, right? That's solipsism. Now, how do you refute that? Well, as a matter of fact, I don't think there actually is a decisive refutation of that. It's actually very hard to refute, because the evidence is compatible with both, right? I mean, if I'm dreaming this right now, if this is just a figment of my imagination, all of this and all of you are a figment of my imagination. None of you actually exist, okay? But I just have the experience of you. Well, on what basis did I ever posit that you all existed for real anyway? Well, I had this experience of you. Well, but my experience of you is consistent with there being only the experience of you and you not actually existing. So both these hypotheses are plausible with respect to the evidence. I don't have no way of testing my theory that there exists a mind-independent reality. I cannot demonstrate it to be true, right? So I can still question this. Now notice, I don't actually doubt that you all exist, that you're all hearing my voice, that this is a glass of scotch here, and it's a physical glass of scotch, that I'm not dreaming it. It's real. I think that this is all real. I am committed to the existence of other people, of other minds, of a whole world out there, a metaphysical ontology that is physical out there independently of my own existence, that existed before I existed and will persist after I'm gone. Okay? But the fact that I don't have any doubts about that, like I really don't doubt it. I can't muster a doubt. I can only pretend, right? That doesn't mean that I can't call it into question and go, I wonder, right? In fact, a lot of philosophy, a lot of the deepest, most fundamental philosophical questions have to do with saying, well, wait a minute. I can't necessarily doubt something, but I can question it. I can ask, why on earth do I think it's true? Right? And then that could affect my confidence. Some doubts could creep in as a result of that. Now, in the case of the mind-independent reality, I don't actually have any genuine doubts. I mean, maybe a niggling doubt. From time to time, some niggling doubt might creep in. But generally, moment by moment, I have no doubts about it. And yet, that is something that I can investigate. I can try to find out, is there a way to test this idea of a mind-independent reality, or that there exist other minds outside of my own? Is there a way to test that? Right? So you can, if you're a good skeptic, apply the tools of critical thinking to things that you don't doubt. So you don't have to doubt something to be skeptical, to apply skepticism. In other words, one way to understand it is this: you were saying, what can you doubt, what can't you doubt, or what can you will, what can't you will. Think of doubt as a product, like a belief, right? You just have it, or you don't, and you have it to the degree that you have it, or you don't have it to the degree that you don't have it, whatever. But skepticism, think of that as an act. It's something you do, something you undertake. There's a mental act that you do, right? You decide to ask a question. Inquiry, examination, interrogation, questioning, looking for evidence, evaluating evidence. All of that, these are mental actions that we do that lie within our control, and we can either not know how to do them or know how to do them and neglect to do them. I don't know which is worse, actually, being so ignorant as to not know, or to know but not bother. I think maybe the latter is worse, certainly more neglectful and more objectionable, I suppose. But neither one of them is good. So the way I think of it, Kyle, is this: doubt isn't something that you will, but skepticism and critical thinking is something that lies within your will. It's something you do. It's an act, whereas the other is just a feeling. It's an attitude that you have towards a proposition. It merely it's a way of talking about your degree of confidence or lack of thing.
I think what it is for me is that I'm using doubt in the way that you're using questioning in that. Yeah. And we're just at a definition interpass here, because like I said earlier, I'm not a philosophy kind of person. I don't, dive into the deep conversations of and that sort of thing. That's just not something that I do. I look at things, very black and white. And when I think of doubt, that to me is an act of seeing, like, for example, I saw there's a guy, I forget the guy's name, but he did a really good TED talk on this very thing. And he was talking about how when that article came out with Jenny McCarthy, where she got the whole anti-vax thing came from, she read it and went straight to, this is the truth, got to, go and spread the word, can't do vaccines. And the fact that she didn't just stop and, think, wait a minute, just because it's in a newspaper, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the gospel truth. And they wound up retracting that. And because of that, you've got this crazy anti-vax movement. Her act, to me, when I use doubt, her act of doubting that article and just taking a step back before she went crazy with how she did, would have stopped that entire movement. And that to me would have been really virtuous, because you wouldn't have the kids who are put in harm's way because of that whole crazy mess. So I think it's just a different, you're using doubt differently than I am.
I agree completely. In fact, I suspected this all along, actually, that the difference between us on this was largely terminological. That when you're talking about doubt, you're thinking about doubt as the act of inquiry, of being skeptical, right? Of critical thinking. Whereas I think of doubt as a feeling that often results from critical thinking, but just as often arises from an absence of critical thinking. I mean,
Sure.
Jenny McCarthy was not shy of any doubt. She wasn't short on any doubts. What happened with her was she read and heard about some connections between autism and vaccinations, and of course she had her own child that had been diagnosed with autism, and what happened was she had doubts. That is to say, she had doubts about the safety and reliability of vaccinations. She had doubts about the trustworthiness and honesty of the medical I mean, her mind was filled with doubts. But what she wasn't was skeptical, right? She didn't exercise her due diligence there. Now, I think in the case of Jenny McCarthy, it's not that she's stupid. It's that she just happens to be ignorant about these kinds of critical thinking tools. She didn't know how to evaluate these claims. She wasn't qualified to evaluate these claims. She didn't set about talking to relevant experts. She didn't up her game and try to learn something about the ways that we evaluate these things. She had no BS detectors that would allow her to recognize that there was one guy with these weird outlier results, and she was not willing to sort of update her game in the face of criticism, right? That is, she was filled with doubts whenever someone came to her and said, well, wait a minute, you don't know what you're talking about. Because if, for instance, the guy was wearing a white lab coat, or if it was a woman with the letters MD after her name, she immediately dismissed them as part of this conspiracy. So she had plenty of doubts, but what she lacked entirely was skepticism. Now, what your position is that, well, right, she lacked skepticism. If she had been skeptical, right, then none of this would have happened. That is, she would not have popularized this movement, because certainly the anti-vax movement was fueled in large part because of her own celebrity and her endorsement of it. So I think, in large part, when I say skepticism, you're hearing doubt, and when you're saying doubt, you're meaning what I mean by skepticism.
Can I read real quick?
I would caution against the equivocation of the two for the reasons that I gave at the outset. That I think you can't decide to doubt, but you can decide to be skeptical. And if you don't have good skeptical tools, you can acquire them. You can set on a path of self-education and acquire these skills and train your mind and acquire the habits of mind that allow you to have a better map revision apparatus in your brain.
Let me, I was looking online earlier, and I found this it kind of breaks it down to what I think of when I mean doubt. And this is actually from a Mormon website, believe it or not, but I think it sums it up pretty well from how I mean what I mean by doubt. And it says, if you possess self-doubt, it is that virtue which makes you question your beliefs, your ideas, your knowledge, even the veracity of what your closest friends tell you. When you contemplate doing something new or asserting some position or fact, postulating a new idea, undertaking a new job or a work project, starting a diet or exercise routine, you immediately feel pangs of self-doubt. It is self-doubt which drives that curiosity, which causes you to inquire, to think, to question what you actually know and what you actually believe. Curiosity drives the spirit of wise, not the foolish. Without curiosity, there is no desire, and desire is the engine of all action. Curiosity keeps moving forward, while self-doubt keeps one from driving headstrong into that new venture. So that, to me, I see it as a virtue because in those instances, it's overly beneficial to kind of take a step back and reflect. and look. You know, just those little feelings of doubt. Now, I think you're right that we're just using a different word for what we mean to be the same thing, but I'm actually coming from it as the act of doing those things. When you get a new job, you take a step back and you feel that those pains of self-doubt.
Yeah, our difference here, I think, really is,
right? But does anybody have a question? I mean, I think we all think that you know, we all should have some kind of doubts. I mean, in certain instances, doubt could be bad, be good. Beliefs can be bad.
Then we agree.
Well, that doesn't make it a virtue.
Well, I don't think it can. I don't think it's good to have doubts. I think you just have them.
Oh no,
right?
How about this?
You have them. What's good about having doubts? I think doubts are good when you doubt things for the right reasons. Just like confidence is good when you're confident for the right reasons.
Yeah, I agree.
So
I
don't think of doubt as good or bad. What's that?
Yeah, I agree. I guess I should rephrase that. Doubt can lead us to correct conclusions, but we don't, like I said, I don't think we should go out of our way to try to be doubtful of things. It's not a good place to be.
Well, I mean, what's the harm?
I don't even think doubt leads us to correct conclusions. I mean, doubt didn't lead Jenny McCarthy to correct conclusions.
Well, hang on, but it can it not?
Well, of course it can, but
right,
see, when you
always will.
Right, but when you speak of something as an epistemological virtue, what I think what we're talking about there is a trait or a procedure or a capacity or a disposition or a habit of mind that on average conduces to true beliefs. And the having of doubts doesn't result in true beliefs. It just as often it leads people into false beliefs, right? So doubt isn't a procedure. Doubt isn't a procedure, right? Certainty isn't a procedure. It's just a byproduct of what you think. It's a measure of your confidence. It's a qualitative descriptor of how confident or unconfident you are in something. You read a passage there, Kyle, that I agreed with, but I would change the terminology a little bit, where it talked about self-doubt and what self-doubt generates. But I don't think it's self-doubt. It's not doubting yourself that generates these things. It's the ability to recognize your own fallibility. Right? That is to say, it's the positive belief that you have been mistaken, and therefore, on the basis of good induction, you're likely to be mistaken again about something. That is the recognition that while, yes, I think everything in my belief set is true, I also paradoxically recognize that it would be a miracle if everything in my existing belief set were true. Surely something in my belief set is mistaken somewhere. Right? I just don't know where. I can't jettison that belief set just because I know I have a false belief somewhere, but I don't know where it is. So it's not self-doubt. It's the recognition of one's fallibility. But all that is to say that you shouldn't be a dogmatist. But that's because dogmatism is the opposite of skepticism and critical thinking. Right? At the antithesis, so you've got these two poles. You've got skepticism and critical thinking, which reliably conduces to the truth. And then you've got dogmatism, okay? And dogmatism is, a person who is dogmatic is someone who resists contrary evidence, for instance. Not because they naturally want to resist it. We all resist contrary arguments. We all do. Everyone does. But a dogmatist is someone who just doesn't have a mind that has been trained to surrender, to yield, okay? And that's what you want to do. You want a mind that says "uncle" in the face of better arguments, right? That's what makes you a critical thinker and a skeptic. It's not whether or not you're willing to change your mind, right? So I mean, there are people out there that are exquisitely rational and intelligent people who are absolutely unwilling to change their minds. They change their minds anyway. Why? Because nobody wills to change their mind anyway. This is why I think the willingness to change your mind or not has nothing to do with whether or not you will change your mind, right? But what really matters is, have you trained your mind to change in response to good reasons and evidence, or do you have a sloppy, undisciplined mind that changes based on all kinds of things, based on how good something feels, how well it sits with what you already believe, what your friends will think, whether someone you admire believes it. I mean, those are all crappy reasons for believing something, right? And if you doubt something because someone you admire doubts something, that's not a good reason to doubt something, right? And so there can be terrible reasons for doubting. And that's why I think doubting shouldn't be considered an epistemological virtue, because doubting just as often leads into error. Because to move from one position to another is to say that you have come to feel confident that one position is true and to have doubts about the old position. Every time you change your mind, whether it's for good or ill, whether it's in the direction of truth or in the direction of error, it's because doubts arose about what you used to believe, right? So doubt is an ingredient in every belief, whether it's true or false. If I think A is true, that means that I have doubts about not A. All right, that's just how that works, right? It's just sort of a simple logical point there. So that's why I think doubt shouldn't be. I mean, would it make sense to say that certainty is a virtue? No, right? But it doesn't matter if you feel certain about something; you can still have your mind changed, right? There are lots of scientists out there who were absolutely wedded, absolutely committed to a particular scientific hypothesis that they may have originated, and then have had the ground pulled out from under their feet by a decisive set of experiments, and they just have to say, how about that? Guess I was wrong. They didn't will themselves to change their minds there. Their minds just changed helplessly because they have disciplined, scientifically trained minds that have been trained, that have learned that evidence is what should make your mind cry, uncle, I surrender, I give. And that's what we want. So that's the critical distinction in my mind. But yeah, in short, I think that the distinction between us has been largely terminological, where I was speaking of skepticism, you were subbing in the word doubt, and vice versa. And I mean, I think that's a sort of blameless mistake. But the reason I think it's a mistake at all is simply because a lot of people think that if they have doubts, that they're critical thinkers. Every person who believes in New Age twaddle, every person who believes in a flat Earth or some other bizarre conspiracy like chemtrails, they will all tell you that they are skeptics. And they will all tell you that they are highly skeptical. And they will all tell you that they are skeptics and critical thinkers because they have doubts, because they think that's what they think that doubting is constitutive of skepticism and critical thinking. And my view is, it is to the advantage of everyone in the skeptical critical thinking movement to distinguish between critical thinking as an act and the mere having of doubts, which happen to us helplessly. And if we can distinguish those two, then we will avoid making the mistake ourselves of thinking that because we have doubts that we have been exercising critical thinking. Just because you doubt something does not make you a critical thinker. And too many of us fall into that. We've all done that. I've done that. Everyone does that.
I would say that certainty wouldn't be considered a virtue because the opposite of virtues aren't virtues. So
they're vices. Yeah, they're vices.
Vice.
Yeah.
Typically not. I mean, it doesn't. Typically, a virtue. I mean, the way I look at virtues in it was more of an Aristotelian thing, is that basically a virtue is that spot between vice try to strive for. If we have things like courage, right, that's going to be in the middle between cowardice and recklessness, right? We don't want to strive to be cowards, and we don't want to strive to be reckless in our actions. We want to have courage, and we want to have courage at all times. Virtues are things, and the way I'm looking at this sentence, is doubt a virtue? I do take it as a philosophical claim, because it's just like a scientific claim. When you use these certain words, these words tend to be philosophically in origin. So this would be a philosophical claim. And what does it mean to be virtuous? Well, generally, when people say what it means to be virtuous, it's something we actually strive, something we want to be at all times. And I think Ozzy is right on this: is that we don't strive to be doubtful. We don't want to be doubtful at all times. We don't want to have doubt. We want to have. IT is good. I don't think it's a virtue, no, but we want to have some kind of at least convinced of things, right? We want to be convinced of truth things. Beliefs can be, obviously, we can be convinced of bad things, or we can be convinced of good things. But is to be convinced of positions that are true. And I don't think doubt is a reliable mechanism to get us there. So I don't see doubt as a virtue in any way, shape, or form like that. Now, I understand the term doubt as a virtue, or the phrase as, you look at doubt, in a colloquial type sense can be good. I get that. I think that's the difference you guys are having is that Kyle is using the word doubt as, hey, look, doubt can be beneficial because it got having beliefs like that. But I think when you're stating something like doubt as a virtue, you stating it as a as a philosophical claim, and that's where the problems kind of get arise, because it's philosophically I cannot see in any way doubt being a virtue. Right. That's how I'm.
There's a way to understand what Kyle's position that I'm very sympathetic to, and that is this.
Sure.
Think of a distinction, for instance, between the having of a doubt and doubting. Right. I mean, doubting is a verb. Right. Doubt is a noun. I have doubts. Right. So and so doubts such and such would be a verb, but you can think of the act of doubting. Right. So, for instance, I think all along Kyle's position has been, look, no, doubting is an act, right? But there, what he's talking about is what I have been talking about as critical thinking and skepticism, right? Mm-hmm. So if you wanted to, you could say, well, listen, I still want to maintain that doubt is a virtue, but really what I mean is doubting as an act, right? And then you'd have to flesh out what you mean by that act. And I think when you fleshed it out, it would amount to what I have called critical thinking and skepticism. So, I mean, really, this is why I think our dispute here is really terminological. And the only reason I think that we need to bother with the analytical distinction that I've been making here is simply that doubt is also a word for, and I think it's primarily, but not exclusively, a word for a feeling, an attitude towards a proposition. And so many people think that when they're having doubts, they're being skeptical, which is why you will hear the most credulous people telling you, oh yeah, I mean, Western biomedicine, I'm very skeptical of that. And, I know that I believe in homeopathy now and stuff like that, and you don't believe that, but believe me, I used to be very skeptical of homeopathy, but I looked into it and, and really all that's happened is looking at doubts.
That's where I would use, once again, I think a different term, and I would be saying that attitude is cynicism coming from me. So I think that what you're talking
some cynicism there.
To me, the attitude of I'm going to go and doubt everything because, of course you don't want to think that you're going to doubt everything. You know what I mean? Like, you're not going to go to start your car and doubt that your car is going to be out in the driveway. I mean, that's just, but if you are cynical, attitude is that, yes, even you're going to make a big deal about your car being in the driveway. So that's not what I would consider doubt. That would be being cynical to me. I think what you're calling doubt for me is what I would call being cynical.
Yeah. Well, you touch on a really interesting thing there about, you wouldn't want to be doubting everything. And obviously you wouldn't want to be doubting anything any more than you'd want to be certain about everything. Both of them would be foolish, which is why I think neither one is a candidate for, that's another reason why neither one is a candidate for a virtue. Whereas I think being a critical thinking, calling everything into question, I think is. I don't think it's ever harmful to call into question even the most obvious things. I mean, logicians or especially philosophers of logic, but logicians as well, call into question the very principles of deduction, principles like modus ponens and modus tollens, and the principle of the excluded middle, and principle of non-contradiction, and so forth. Right? These are bedrock assumptions that all of us make, and they're invaluable in certain systems of logic. They're definitive of certain systems of logic. And nevertheless, they call them into question. Right? I don't know that they have doubts about them. Maybe some of them do. But the point is, you can always call something into question. And now nobody can call everything into question all the time any more than I can. I can't be like looking at a glass of scotch at any given moment. And I can't always be asking, I wonder if I'm dreaming. But I think it's never harmful. It's never dangerous to ask yourself, am I dreaming? Right? I think it's a fine question, and it's a deep question. And I think that questioning, interrogating, even the things that you think are rock solid, right? That those are, that too is a virtue. You are exercising your critical thinking skills on the very things that you take for granted. The things that you take for granted are the things that really you ought to be scrutinizing. I mean, if you fancy yourself a critical thinker and a skeptic, the things that you take for granted, that's the very stuff you ought to train your skepticism on and examine it and see what you turn up. And you don't have to doubt it to do that.
So I guess my last question would be, for you to determine what would be considered a virtue, is it something that you would always want to do in every situation?
No, a virtue is not something you would want to do in every situation, but it's something that on average is going to be conducive to some value that you have. So for instance, honesty is a moral virtue that is conducive to trust and augmenting your reputation, for instance, for people trusting you and so forth, right? But it's not always the right thing to do, to be honest. There are times when you should lie. It's not just the case that there are times when it's permissible to lie. I would submit that there are times when it is morally obligatory to lie. Right? But on average, honesty is the best policy. That's what that saying, honesty is the best policy, means. It's the best policy. It's policy. But it doesn't mean that it's exceptionless. And there's never a case where a lie is permissible or even necessary. And it's the same thing with courage, right? I mean, you want to be courageous, but that doesn't mean that you'll never back down from a fight.
So I wouldn't doubt fit in with those.
I have a little different.
Well, doubt's the same thing. Doubt, you want to be able in any given moment to doubt something, but only if it's worthy of doubt. Like, you shouldn't feel confident about something unless it's warranted. You shouldn't doubt something unless it's warranted. I mean, yeah, is it a virtue to doubt that there's a mind-independent reality? Is it virtuous to think that none of you exist, that you're all figments of my imagination? I don't think there's any virtue in that. I don't think that conduces to the truth, right? But I think there's a virtue in examining my beliefs, all of my beliefs, right? That, I think, is never going to hurt me. That, I think, on average, will leave me better positioned to have an accurate map that is being ever revised in the right direction, in the direction of veracity, rather than the direction of falsehood. So yeah, I think there are plenty of times when you shouldn't be having doubts. And a person who is cynical, a person that has what we would call a suspicious mind, right? That is a person whose mind is just crippled by doubt. Right, that person has a mind that is crippled by doubts because they're doubting all the wrong things, which is to say, they have doubts that aren't warranted. That is, I mean, think of what it means to doubt something. I mean, doubting something means thinking that's probably not true. It means that you regard something as dubious. Now, if what you mean by doubt in this case is what I mean by skepticism, then of course there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with being skeptical, but the psychological feeling of doubt, I think, requires warrant, just like the psychological feeling of certainty requires warrant. You better have some good reasons for being true.
I would follow that up with saying that to me, the most harm that will come from you doubting something is that you take steps to confirm what you originally thought was true. You know what I'm saying? Like if you doubt something that you pretty much know is true, all you're going to do is take the steps to find out that it is in reality true. There's no kind of downside.
But taking those steps is what I would call the interrogation. That's the inquiry, right? And it's not enough to just ask a question. You have to know how. You have to have some sense of how to answer a question, right? And so that's where skepticism comes in. That's where critical thinking tools come in. That's where understanding of formal logic comes in, and understanding of induction comes in, and understanding of scientific methodology comes in, right? All of these things come in because it's not enough to ask a question. Any fool can ask a question. But an interrogation isn't just someone randomly asking somebody questions. It's asking questions with a purpose, with a view to obtaining certain answers. You have to know what to ask and how to ask, and how to understand the answers that come back. And so all of our critical thinking tools are tools that allow us, that help us figure out what questions to ask and how to understand the answers that reason and the empirical world deliver to us in response to our questions.
I think we're on the same.
So it's not enough to ask questions, and it's certainly not enough to just think that something is dubious.
I think we're on the same
I
page.
think you guys are on the same page. I just have one.
Yeah, I think we are.
Ozzy, that I kind of disagree with per se, but I have a different opinion. Maybe, you were saying that you shouldn't always strive for these things. I kind of disagree. I think that virtues are things you strive for continually at all times. However, that's why it's called that sweet spot. If I strive for honor, that means I want to be honorable, but not to the point where I'm being brute honest. I don't want to have unvarnished honesty. So that sweet spot is when to know when to have the jump of honesty, courage, same thing. Just because I can run away to fight another day in some instances, that might be the courageous act to do. So I think that when we are have virtues, talking about things we strive for, it's just what degree of it. I mean, it's that fine line to where we go from one point to we're in a vice or to what's called a deficiency vice or an excess vice. We're in that middle where we're trying to find it. And can we ever succeed to that? Maybe not. I think these things may be idealistic, that I don't think any of us can be perfectly virtuous, strive for. And that's why I don't think that belief or doubt or certainty, anything are in any reasonable measure can be considered virtues.
Yeah, well, as I've already said, I don't think that certainty and doubt can be construed as virtues or shouldn't, unless you are somehow construing doubt as meaning critical thinking and inquiry and skepticism.
That's just relabeling it.
But let me say that I agree with what you just said there about the sweet spot, right? I mean, there's a theory of ethics, a meta-ethical position called virtue ethics or virtue-based ethics, where right actions are to be understood in terms of certain characteristics about a person. That morality is about the cultivation of a certain kind of personality, a certain kind of character, right? What kind of character? Well, an honest character, a noble character, a courageous character, a patient character, a gentle character, a generous character. There are all these qualities that we think of, right? A temperate character, right? And so forth. Someone who's self-controlled and so forth. Right? These are all moral virtues, right? And then there's this idea of epistemological virtues that conduce to the truth. They don't conduce to the moral good, but they conduce to the truth, having true beliefs. And moral virtues, as you said, there's always a sweet spot. In the case of courage, for instance, there's a point in there somewhere between being cowardly and somewhere between being completely reckless and foolhardy and endangering other people with your actions, right? Somewhere in between there lies bravery, what we regard as courage or bravery, right? And it's the same thing with honesty. You can be honest at the wrong times, and what it means to exhibit or exemplify the moral virtue of honesty is to understand when honesty is called for and why it's called for, and so to be honest when it is called for, and to not be when it's not called for. And I think it's going to be the same thing with respect to epistemological virtues, right? Now, so if critical thinking and skepticism is an epistemological virtue, what I think that has to mean is there's a time and place for inquiry, right? I don't think that in the middle of lovemaking is the time to start asking certain kinds of questions about the nature of physical reality. I don't think that's the time and place. Well, I think it's not conducive to the truth. I don't think you're going to be in a mental
I
state
doubt
in
that's
that
true.
moment.
I doubt
And having been in enough moments of unbridled passion, I can attest to the fact that such
TMI.
moments are not moments when you are going to be best able
Go
to
on.
revise and update your belief set.
Do you guys room together?
So I think that epistemological virtues have to be understood in the same way as moral virtues. There's a sweet spot there. A person who is questioning everything all the time isn't a skeptic. That person is at best a cynic and at worst an idiot. And someone who does not interrogate, does not question his or her own beliefs and the beliefs of others, and is just naively credulous the way a small child is. Small children believe everything that they're told effectively. You have to sort of learn to be critical thinkers and skeptical, right? At first, we're like little ducklings. We just believe whatever mama tells us, which is why we believe Santa and in gods and all kinds of things as children. We just drink it in with our mother's milk, because we start off as naive credulists and learn to be critical thinkers and skeptics by degrees over time, by the discovery of errors within our own belief set. We learn to be mistrustful of the words of others. We learn to mistrust our senses. We learn about the unreliability of our own memories and things like that. So we learn our own epistemological limits and the limits of the testimony of other people. So we learn to become skeptical slowly by degrees. We don't start off that way. We don't start off tabula rasa and then build up a world out of that. We actually just start off believing every old dumb thing that we're told. We just trust our senses. We trust our memories. We trust the people around us to impart the truth, that they're reliable purveyors of information. And we slowly learn to become skeptical as we discover error in our belief set. And we have to revise. So a person who gets halted in their belief revision process, if they never learn to up their game with respect to critical thinking and skepticism, that's erring in the other direction, and that too is a mistake. So obviously we don't want to become dogmatists, right? So you've got the person who is sort of a wide-eyed crazy cynic, who questions everything and doesn't want to affirm a belief in anything for fear of landing in error. And then at the other end, you have the naive, credulous, and dogmatist who believes something completely dogmatically and won't revise his or her belief set. Well, skepticism and critical thinking is that set of tools, cognitive tools, brain processes, social practices, that put you right in that sweet spot. And you can zero in closer and closer to the very center of that bullseye by learning about critical thinking.
Well, I think we've all reached a consensus here. Yay, Mazel Tov.
I'm glad we all agree.
I'm glad we didn't come to blows anyway.
I would have guessed Ozzy.
Listen, I can't stick around, and I want to apologize. I looked in the live chat, and the questions were sort of zipping up the screen too fast for me to read or follow. So I apologize for the people who had questions that I didn't get to, but maybe we can have a follow-up discussion or something some other time.
Yeah, there was a lot of questions. But unfortunately, it is getting late, and I think that most of the questions were more of a, like I said, a more technical kind of thing, or they wanted some more guidance on what these things are in philosophy. Another topic on it, or I'm not going to have an after show or anything, but maybe somebody else wants to. That's fine. Looks like everybody's not ready to pass out. It's been a long day. This is for some of us our third thing today, so
Yeah, I don't know. You guys have a lot of stamina for this kind of thing.
No, we don't.
At my age, I'm lucky to have stamina for anything. So yeah, I'll take it.
I'm actually duct taped to my chair right now. That's how I'm.
It's the same topic. And look, I enjoyed it very much, and I appreciate you coming in, Ozzy. I mean, we've done conversations
Absolutely.
I know where Kyle's coming from. It's just, you know, we all have our own positions on these things, and I do very strongly think that when you put forth these types of things, statements like "is doubt a virtue," I do think that you're presenting them as a philosophical claim. Now, if you say I'm not presenting as a philosophical claim, argumentium ad dictionarium.
I am just reading what the dictionary says, sir. How dare you accuse me of going in philosophy?
You know what's funny is you don't find that very often in places. You find it on Rational Wiki, which I'm not a big fan of, but I think they do get that right. But Rational Wiki stuff in it. For Rational page, have you ever read that page? It's got some weird stuff on it. Rational Wiki.
Yeah, I've dipped into it now.
Yeah, it's kind of odd. But anyways, maybe we can follow up later on my channel, a little more technical stuff. But I do want to thank you for coming in, Ozzy. I love these discussions, and I know that the live chat really enjoys listening to you. Even half the time they don't know what anybody's saying. It's cool. It's fun.
Don't worry, live chat.
Thank you. It was very nice talking to you, Kyle, by the way. I think this is the first sort of sustained conversation we've had.
I've looked up to, I was telling Ozzy the other day, I looked up to him for a while. I even coached Steve with the idea of doing anything that kind of evolved into non-sec. I had been a big fan, huge fan. So for me, it's a pleasure and honor to finally get to be on this side of with you. So it's kind of like meeting one of your heroes. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Go check out his presuppositional videos. Yeah, they're great.
If you're like me, you won't be able to follow along too much, but it sounds really good. So just
it's kind of like porn. You don't have to follow the plot.
That's right.
Okay.
And it's got all that cheesy music. I've got all that cheesy
Wrap your head around that one. There you go. I'll leave you with that one.
Take that however you will. Yes. But yeah, thank you, Ozzy, very much for coming in. I think that Steve and I have argued over this for several weeks now, and it's good that we can finally put this to bed, that Kyle was right all along. So thank you for justifying that, Ozzy. And guys, we'll see you tomorrow at 8 at 8 o'clock for Jehovah's Witnesses.
I'll have to watch that for sure.